Thanks. There's a lot of people here. Huh? I was a little nervous. By the way, first of all, Creative Mornings team, this is amazing what you've built, right? Can we hear it for them? This is. I'm very impressed, and I'm so proud that something like this is coming up. What a great space. To the folks at the library, thank you for hosting this, making this possible. I was nervous about this, not just because there were so many beautiful people coming, but because of the theme. See, I usually have a speech that I go and I give it to Rotaries, and I go and I give it to all these, groups of retired folks, or sometimes high school students or something. But it's the same sort of cobbled together speech. It's the same kind of stump speech as like what a politician might do. So it's in my brain. It's chiseled in my brain. It's easy to do. But then they said, well, hey, we want you to come speak, but you have to speak about love. And I was like, well, okay, that'll be easy. We'll figure that out. But I don't know what to say about love. I don't really have any particular insight about love. So I started where you start. I started on Google. I said, what is love in Google? And of course, that song by Hathaway came up. What is love? It was, that's a weird video, by the way. You should check it out. It's a little strange. I don't know what he's trying to demonstrate that love is. It's a haunted house of some kind he's running through. Women are running backwards. So I tried to get it. I read some of the things. There was religious texts. There was another text, from a psychology paper about what love is. So I thought I'd come at it really intellectually, right? Make it clear. I didn't get anything. So I thought to myself, well, what do I love? I love my wife. I love my kids a lot. But I love cheesesteak sandwiches, too. What have we done to that word, right? Where the love means that I love my wife and I love my kids, but I also love cheesesteak sandwiches. I said, does that mean that we've bastardized that term, that we've ruined that term, that we're using it wrong? No, of course not. We do everything right, so we're fine. No, love is a word that expresses something about an ache, right? An ache for something or someone that we just didn't decide to have and that we can't control. But it's there. We can manage it. In fact, I should manage the cheesesteak sandwich thing a little better. I don't need cheese or steak or sandwiches probably. But for your kids, if you look at it, it's like a spectrum, right? At the top are your kids and your wife. And then, at the bottom is the cheesesteak sandwich. But it's all a different level of vulnerability. Something that you can't control, right? You have to manage it, but you can't control it. Having kids is a nightmare. But I don't mean in the traditional sense that, this is a nightmare. I mean, it's a nightmare. Every day, there's a highlight reel in the back of your mind of the horrible things that can happen. And it's scary, right? They climb up a stairs or they walk around in a sidewalk and you picture a car coming off the sidewalk. You picture the ladder falling. It's a constant highlight of things that can go wrong. And I ask people who have kids that are older, I say, does it get better? No. It doesn't, apparently. So it's just they're farther and you can control them even less. You can manage them even less. So it's like a constant vulnerability, right? It's something that you can't control. It's just you admitting you can't control it. And sort of, you can't put that highlight reel away, you just have to live with it. And so I thought, well, all of these things, the whole spectrum of love is a different level of vulnerability. And we only really make connections, it feels like, in this world when we let ourselves be vulnerable a little bit. Have you ever built a friendship or a love relationship or anything without just embracing that vulnerability, without just being afraid, without just losing that control for a second? That's what I think that love is. And I think it usually comes from stories. We learn stories and we make a story and we tell a story. And when we might make a connection with somebody, it's because we've we've offered something of ourselves, of our own story to them that we're a little bit vulnerable about, that they might hurt us with. But we're going to let it happen. We're going to let it go out. So I lived for a long time with this sense of control, that I could control my story, right? And I could let people in. I could be vulnerable on a personal basis. But in the professional realm, I wasn't very good at it, actually. I wasn't very good about being vulnerable in my professional life. So just dial back a little bit. Voice of San Diego started 11 years ago. I was in my 20s. I'm now almost 40. I was immediately sort of I thrust myself into a position of leadership about 10 years ago and took over the organization, along with my partner, Andrew Donahue, my partner in employment. And we took this place over, and we didn't really know what we were doing, right? But the one thing that we did when we first got into it was he said, we're going to focus on investigative journalism. We're going to cut a lot of this stuff, and we're going to focus on investigative journalism. And as executives, we had to learn some key things about being an executive. When you hear somebody say, well, does that person have executive experience, especially in the political realm? I didn't really know what that means or what that meant. I do now. There's a few principles involved with it. One is you have to learn how to hire people, hire them well. The other is you have to learn how to delegate responsibility, because you can't do everything. If you want to build an organization, you're going to have to let other people handle stuff. And the third is you had to learn how to fire people. And that was hard, but it was a lesson I learned. It was difficult. Nothing I want to do ever, but it's something you just have to do sometimes. So I learned these things, and we focused Voice on investigative journalism. And we started to have some success. Some big stories came out. We uncovered some corruption. We uncovered embezzlement. We made change in San Diego that a lot of people had wondered whether it would ever happen in these agencies that we investigated. And that got us some attention. And things were rolling. Everything was pretty great. And the New York Times came. New York Times came to our office and interviewed us. The photographer came. They put us on the front page. And everybody reminded me, they said, isn't that ironic that you got so much validation being on the front page of a newspaper, even though you're an online news outlet? I was like, yeah, I'll take it. We call it, to this day, the people who were there, we call it the New York Times Day, because it changed everything after that. Being on the front page of the New York Times has enormous consequences. And so for a year, we got calls from around the country. We flew around the country. We had journalists from Japan come to our office. We're huge in Japan. They came and they'd interview us. They'd say, what's the deal? What are you doing? All this stuff. It was fantastic. We found ourselves in the middle of this swirl of discussion about the future of the news industry. We were the answer suddenly. Wow. We just were doing some work in San Diego, and all of a sudden, newspapers are collapsing around the country, and here we were, part of the answer. And so I got to go to all these conferences, New York, Minnesota, Chicago, all of these places, and talk and say, boy, I got the answer. Figured it out. And I was there, like, very in control of my story, right? And we were getting grants from around the country, and things were doing well. We were hiring people. I wasn't delegating very well, but I was getting a little bit better here and there. And over time, we built this kind of scattershot operation of different things we were covering based on the grants we were getting. It was good. It was fun. We created products that we still have, that people still love. The Morning Report. You should get it. voicesandiego.org, Morning Report. The Morning Report is still around 7-8 years later. And it's our most popular product. We created it during this period. We created a partnership with NBC 7 San Diego. We still have that partnership, and it's still powerful. It's still wonderful. I'm still on every week. It's great. All of these things we created in this time, it was this flowering of our creativity, of our new products, of trying to handle this issue of what's happening to the local news world, and what can we do to be a part of creating new things that help people understand their community. And we created all these theories, too. Well, we're not journalists, we're educators. We don't just write. We got to make sure that the concepts we do come across. Everything was coming smoothly. But a lot of these grants and such that I had gotten, a lot of these, national support, a lot of different things, I didn't really plan very well. I was a new executive, remember, and there was a principle that I hadn't learned quite yet. I didn't even know existed. Time went on, 2011 came. In 2011, some of these grants didn't come in. There wasn't a lot of things, a lot of new money coming in. For some reason, just cash flow started going down. And I was scared. And I didn't know, what we were going to do about it, but I maintained this control of the story. Because we're on track. We got it. We got to figure it out. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's good. We got a good product. We're doing this thing. It's creating a new thing in the community. Everybody still loves us. I'm still going on all these trips. But there was a dark spot that was getting bigger and bigger. And I didn't tell anybody about it. And I didn't really help people understand what was about it. My CFO knew, and I was kind of comforted that she wasn't freaking out. But then one day, she and I talked, and she's like, you need to tell the board of directors that it's not clear how we're going to make payroll in a couple months. And I'll never forget that feeling. All of a sudden, I had avoided vulnerability so much. I had avoided sharing this part of my story, this negative part of the story, what I thought was negative, because I wanted to be in control. I wanted to show the perfect face to the community, perfect face to everybody. And so all of a sudden, now I had to really confront, say, hey, this thing's in trouble. And it was all of a sudden out of my control, more than I ever could have thought. And the board of directors said, okay, we're going to figure this out, but you're going to have to cut some staff. And you have to picture what this was like for us, because we were a family. The staff was a family. We were so productive in part because we had created this family feel. I went out with them all the time. We were friends. We were brothers and sisters. That's how we were so productive. That's how we got so much done. That's how we made such an impact. And all of a sudden, I was going to have to cut, I thought were 2 of them. But this was so out of my control at this point that they said, well, you got to add another to that list. And all of a sudden, the board meeting happens. My heart sinks. I'm sick. I can't eat. I couldn't sleep. And they said, well, I said, when do we need to do this? And they said, you need to do it right now. I said, I can't do that. We got an event tomorrow night. I can't lay off 3 of these people that the community really knows and cares about and loves, and then invite them to this event afterwards. That's all we're going to talk about at the event. I can't do that. So they said, fine, you can have your event the next morning. Do it. It was all out of my control. I had no leverage at that point to fix it, to demand anything. I had so avoided vulnerability and sharing my own issue, this own part of my story, that it had become so vulnerable that it was out of my control completely. I couldn't even manage it. But I had to go through with this. And this was the principle I had to learn, right? The last principle. It's okay. It's easier to fire somebody because ostensibly it's their fault. But when you have to lay somebody off, it's your fault. And so we had a horrible morning because one of our people that we had to lay off, she was going on a road trip, leaving early in the morning. So I had to invite her to come to the office at like 6 a.m. And then, of course, word spreads, and everybody that we had to bring in at 6 a.m. And I remember she sat there, and I said, we have to let you go. I'm sorry. And we cried. And then we cried again when the next person came in, and we cried again when the next person came in, and I cried all morning. And it was awful. It was the worst thing I have ever had to do. And I hated it, and I thought, okay, it's finally over, and then I realized, oh God, I got to meet with the staff. And if you've ever met with a group of journalists, you know what they look like? They look like this. They just stare at you and look in your, they don't believe a single word you say. And this was at the height of that. And I was like trying to tell them why I didn't prepare as well for this as I should have, and that I was sorry, but we were going to be stronger. And it was awful. And I thought, okay, well, now it's done. but it wasn't. Because you can lay off people at a bank, you can lay off people in a university, you can lay off people all across the community, and journalists will put it in their paper maybe, but you lay off journalists. So calls started coming in. Across the country, I'm doing interviews about why this happened from these media observers, because remember, we were this darling, right? Because I had made this image of how darling we were. And it was awful. I hated doing those interviews. So it was bad, but was it bad? Something really special happened after that. We got money. People said, why didn't you tell us that you needed money? I didn't even know you were a nonprofit. I got tweets. The Twitter that day was awful. But I got these tweets saying, why didn't you tell us you were going to do this if you didn't? We would have given money. I said, I told you we needed money. They said, no, you didn't. You didn't say this was going to happen. I said, well, I'm not going to hold a gun to somebody's face and say, I'm going to let them go if you don't give me $35. And it was like, well, okay. But I realized I hadn't told the story of voice. Here I was going around the community talking about everybody's negative issues. There are things that are wrong in their organizations, things that are wrong in the government. And I had not told anybody about what was wrong with us, or what was something they could help with, or what our story was. I was such a good storyteller, but I hadn't told our story. At that point, we had hired somebody, Mary Walter Brown, she's over here. And she had just gotten this concept in my head, like, hey, nobody knows your story. You're out there living it, you're going up and down with it, but you aren't telling it. And it would be a good one. And if people were enrolled in it, if they were enrolled in your story, if you were vulnerable, if you had told them about it, you would have a connection with them, and they would want to be a part of that story. They would want to influence it. They would want to see that the outcome came out better. And once this jarring experience happened, so many people in the community were so upset about it that it did happen. Money did come in. Things were better. The next year, we had the best year ever. And it was like, oh, I could have just told our story. I could have been more open. But it would have required me to be not in control of all parts of it, right? It would have required me not to be always perfect or the darling. It would have required me to admit that some parts of this world wasn't in my control. And that would have been hard, but I should have done it. And that was the last principle I learned. So fast forward a few years, and we're better at it. We have a lot of ways of telling our story. In fact, people are always saying, boy, Voice of San Diego tells their story too much. They self-promote too much. They talk about their needs too much. And I'm like, that's good. You're getting it. We're trying that. That's kind of what we're trying to do. But I was at an event. I do a lot of moderating of events, of panels. And I was at one at the Prado in Balboa Park. And it was about education. And there was a guy in the front row, and he was like mildly heckling me, and I was like, it wasn't like a Bernie bro, like just yelling and throwing stuff. It was just a guy like mumbling, and it was just weird. He was in the front row, and so I went up to him afterwards, after the whole panel was over, and I said, why are you agitated? What was the problem? He said, well, I hate what you do. And I said, what do you mean, what do I do? What do I do? And he said, well, I hate what you do. You're trying to destroy schools, and you're always negative. I said, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not trying to destroy the school district. My son is a student in the traditional school and school district. I'm not trying to destroy the school district. I have nightmares about bad schools. I am terrified of the idea that there might be a star student at a school, but who doesn't have anything to do for 3 periods because there's no AP classes or there's no baccalaureate program. I have these nightmares about a school that's just not good for some of these kids, and I just want us to talk about schools that aren't good, because you know what? If there's a school that's not good, but it doesn't admit that it's not good, are the parents going to volunteer for it? Are they going to raise money for it? Are they going to be active there? Is the school district going to give it what it needs if everything's perfect all the time? No, because that message is now embedded in me, right? We have to be honest about things that aren't going very well. And he said, well, that's fine, that's a good point. But look, what about Balboa Park? You're always talking about how bad Balboa Park is. You do all these stories about how bad Balboa Park is. And I was like, oh, that's true, and a light bulb went off in my head. There's a reason for that, actually. We did a bunch of stories about, there was one story we did about maintenance and infrastructure issues at Balboa Park and some of the deferred maintenance issues. Buildings are falling apart in Balboa Park. There was one museum where urine was dripping on some of the exhibits in the basement because some of the building parts were falling apart, and we did the story about that. And we added up all the deferred maintenance, and we talked about all the access issues, the trees that were dying. We did that, and you know where that came from or where that started? Well, I had several months earlier been invited to speak at a group of Balboa Park philanthropists and people who supported Balboa Park, and they said, we have a question for you. We need your help on something. You do a lot of writing about the Chargers issue in San Diego, and we want Balboa Park to get as much as attention as the Chargers do, because Balboa Park's in trouble. And I said, have you told people that? Because I guarantee you, if you asked 1,000 people in San Diego, what's wrong with Balboa Park? You know what they'd say? 995 of them would say, Balboa Park's awesome. There's nothing wrong with Balboa Park. Balboa Park's fantastic. It may be hard to park a little bit or something like that, but it's a great place. Nobody knows that there's a problem at Balboa Park. I said, you haven't been vulnerable about your own story. You haven't shared your story about what it is. If I were to ask you 10 things that are wrong with Balboa Park, could you list them right now? And they said, yeah. I said, well, why doesn't everybody know that? Because if they were enrolled in your story and your own vulnerability, if it wasn't just us talking about how great Balboa Park was all the time, and they knew what was wrong with it, wouldn't they want to do something to help it? And they said, yeah. And he said, would you help us do that? I said, sure. Let's investigate the problems with Balboa Park. And so we spent the next several months doing a lot of this. And guess what? For the first time in a long time, Balboa Park, a new funding stream has been identified in the city budget for Balboa Park. Because people were more than ever enrolled, and they credited our reporter, Lisa Halverstadt, for that. Because people were enrolled in the fact that this needed help. And it wasn't that we were talking poorly about Balboa Park or that we were naysaying or whatever. It was that we were identifying problems that people needed to talk about. And I said, the difference between Balboa Park and the Chargers is extreme. Say what you want about football, but you know what football does really well? Football tells stories really well. NFL football is a giant soap opera. It really is. Think about it. Oh, this guy said something mean about me earlier in the week. Oh, what are they going to do when they face off on Sunday? All of it, the whole season is about that. Boy, he said the mean thing, and they're going to put it on the wall, and they're going to rally. They're going to be strong. Everything about every aspect of football is a story, right? And the NFL does whatever it can to enroll you in each part of these stories so that when they want a stadium, everybody's like, yeah, let's build a stadium. Not everybody. This is a lot of people. A lot of people who are against that, by the way. But there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, we should mobilize. And the city council mobilized faster than I've ever seen them mobilize to try to protect the Chargers last year. He fired up at $2 million to clear the way for an environmental impact report for the stadium in Mission Valley, just like that. It was fascinating. It was the last time they did something like that for Balboa Park. But it was because the story was so ingrained in people's heads. All of these dramas about football is so ingrained in their head. They had done a far exaggerated example of enrolling people in their story, right? Well, there's one story they haven't enrolled people in. You don't see them talk much about the concussion issue from their own sites. But that's like the meta story about football, an existential story. Does football even last? It's another issue. But all of these stories are so important. And this is how we show, I think, our love for San Diego. Is that in order for people to care about the schools that need attention, the parks that need attention, the roads that need attention, all of these things that we care about rely on a story of vulnerability, of us admitting maybe things aren't perfect. Let's talk about how we're going to make them perfect. And we're doing this in the midst of a changing media world that is really, really interesting and scary. Recently, the UT, of course, was purchased, the Union Tribune, right? And they moved, the first thing they did was they moved the printing press from Mission Valley up to LA. And they cut 150 jobs, good blue-collar jobs, moved up to LA. Now they ship the paper down from LA. The newspaper industry is falling apart. And it's not because people don't care about stories or that they're not reading these things. It's because the economic foundation of these enterprises has crumbled completely. They moved the printing press up there because they combined it with the LA Times, which means that they can cut their costs a little bit of how much it costs to get this paper out to everybody. Think about it. The idea of communicating is still telling these stories, but doing it by writing something on a piece of paper and then hauling it to somebody's house every day. But that's the model that still pays the bills. And all newspapers right now, every single one of them are marching toward a cliff. And the cliff is out there. It's the moment where revenues come down to the point where it's below worth even publishing and printing that newspaper. And it's a moment that I'm sure many of them have actually projected exists at this certain time. So combining these kinds of print facilities and other things to save money is an effort to put that moment off a little bit further so that they can work to try to create an economic system and model to protect this storytelling mechanism that we have had for generations now, the newspaper. And the newspaper didn't do a perfect job of telling the stories of a community, but let me tell you, it's not going to get any better until we figure this thing out. So I still love being part of a system where we're trying to create that, where we're trying to tell those stories and create those connections. But it's never going to be the ubiquitous paper of before, where you expect the paper to do the good stories and then expect them to do the hard-hitting ones. Because we're going to live in a world, I think, where there's a bunch of different outlets serving different roles in the community. A bunch of different feeds. As you all well know, looking on your smartphones, there's feeds coming from everywhere. And there's going to be a lot of booster feeds, a lot of feeds out there painting a beautiful, glorious picture of the way San Diego is. And those are important feeds. There are very good things happening in this community. And I want those feeds to thrive. But those feeds have more resources right now. Those feeds are getting more resources. The ratio between journalists and PR and promoting professionals is changing. This one is getting smaller and that one is getting larger. I believe there's a lot of emphasis and investment going on in that effort to promote and tell the good and interesting stories and beautiful stories. But we still have to try to tell the real stories and the deeper stories and the uncomfortable stories and the ones that make us cringe. And we have to do that amongst a new type of pressure and an environment right now that is really scary. I didn't sleep very well last night. And one of the reasons is because I was haunted by a story I heard very late last night. 2 officers were shot. One of them died. And the police chief had to go to the officers who died, his house, at like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., knock on the door and tell him what happened. And I can't get that image out of my mind. I was laying in bed just thinking, wow, that's awful. That's a story, right? That's a connection now. I don't like that, but it's there. The stories are bad and scary and negative and vulnerable, but they need to be told and we need to care about them. And what's so special about what we're doing here at Creative Mornings and what you're doing every month is telling stories and becoming part of a system to tell San Diego's story and to understand San Diego's story. There's a lot of things happening in the world with Trump, with Hillary, with all of these different political forces with Brexit, all these things going on, and we can't control those. We can't even manage those. A lot of us can't. Maybe there's some big shots in this room that are part of the discussion. But if you get involved in a story in San Diego, if you hear a story that touches you in San Diego, you can do something about it. There are so many stories of schools that need help, of the homeless situation, of different enterprises that need volunteers or money or whatever. Stories that are right now not at their conclusion, including ours. We have a story this year as well. We need money again. But there's all kinds of stories around the community. And we all have to realize that if we're going to make those connections, the same kind of connections that create the love and the relationships and the friendships that we want and that make us thrive and that make us give us purpose in the morning, we have to be willing to acknowledge the vulnerable part of it too. The things that aren't quite perfect. The story that I should have told years ago and that I'm still working on telling, because we will never make the connection with people unless we're just a little bit vulnerable, unless we're just a little bit more comfortable with the things we don't like. And I'm dedicated to telling those stories. I'm trying to. We can always get better. But if you see a story or a person working to tell stories, see what you can do to understand it and make a connection with them. Because we need them, and we need them about all parts of the community, all schools, all institutions, everything. Thank you.